second that they realized that she was gone, the FBI should have immediately jumped in and taken over?
I think once this moved from a search posture to a possible kidnapping, the FBI, they're the premier agency in the world to deal with kidnappings. And that's something that our medium-sized law enforcement agency probably just doesn't have the experience to handle. We have 96 detectives, and they're very hardworking detectives, and they've been putting in very long hours each week since she's been missing.
We are receiving critical updates tonight in the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe, because in this report, we are breaking down the one question that has continued to trouble investigators from the very beginning of this case. Why Nancy, why this home, and why this family? For weeks now, FBI behavioral experts have been analyzing every detail, every movement, and every decision connected to that night. And while Nancy Guthrie is still missing, investigators now believe they may be uncovering a key reason behind why she was taken.
Good that you have two agencies working together. It's a joint investigation. The FBI brings a lot to the investigation because they have access to so many tools that perhaps Pima County doesn't have. They also bring a lot of experience. I'm not saying Pima County doesn't have a lot of experience, but as we know, Pima County is a pretty nice, affluent community. And usually when you have very nice, affluent communities, there's really not that much volume of work, right? I'm not saying they're good detectives, but you become a better investigator by the volume of work, right? So when I was a detective in the squad, you're catching like 300, maybe 400 cases a year. That's a lot. And if you're investigating all that, that's a lot of experience. So, you're not born a very better investigator. It's just the work experience. So it's good. It's good that it's collaboration between the FBI.
Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is a great-grandmother. She is someone who relied on routine medical care to maintain her health and stability. She had difficulty moving without assistance and depended on consistent medication to manage her condition. She also required a pacemaker to regulate her heart. In cases like this, investigators typically begin by examining whether the victim fits a pattern, and in this situation, that pattern immediately raises concern. This is not a profile commonly associated with random acts of violent abduction.
Case of blocking evidence from the FBI, that's just so far from the truth.
We asked him why not send the DNA samples to the FBI's lab.
There's gloves found. So FBI says, okay, so should we send them to the FBI lab? I said, no, let's send it all to our lab. Let's just keep it all in one place. Our lab does good work. Their lab does good work. We talked to the FBI. They said, yep, makes sense. Thanks, Sheriff. And we move on to the next problem.
So you're basically saying this is maybe one person that had a problem with it, but you feel like...
You got 400 officers out there working together. They're not always going to see eye to eye.
Are you sharing the results
Everything.
with FBI?
Oh, absolutely.
Yet investigators believe the individual responsible did not act impulsively, did not make an error, and did not arrive at the location by chance. They believe Nancy Guthrie was deliberately selected. Since the early stages of the investigation, authorities have been working to answer a central question. Why would someone target an elderly woman living alone in a quiet residential area? What was the objective behind the act, and what does that decision reveal about the offender? According to multiple behavioral experts, those answers could significantly change how this case is interpreted. One of the most critical elements under examination is the timing of the incident.
I was a reporter here for many years before going to New York, and I just want to make sure that the public understands that this is a mom that's missing and is of the utmost importance, which is why many of my colleagues in law enforcement here had some concerns with the way the sheriff was managing this, and especially his communication, or very poor communication, to the public, making statements that were, well, quite frankly, just awful and incorrect, and taking actions that were incorrect as well. So a number of us decided we needed to say something about it, because we did not want it to reflect on our community and the Sheriff's Department, which has been an extraordinary law enforcement agency that I worked with for 3 decades and had a national reputation.
Nancy Guthrie was taken at approximately 2 in the morning. Not during daylight hours when activity is visible. Not during the evening when neighbors are still awake. But in the middle of the night, when the surroundings are at their quietest, at that hour, most homes are dark. Most individuals are asleep. There are fewer lights, fewer potential witnesses, and almost no movement in residential streets. Choosing that moment suggests awareness. It suggests preparation. It suggests the offender understood exactly when the environment would present the least resistance. Investigators believe this timing was not coincidental but calculated. It reflects someone who either studied the location beforehand or possessed knowledge of the neighborhood's routine.
We haven't narrowed it down to anything other than we have certain pieces of evidence that we're looking at. Chase leads until you either make it or...
Another aspect investigators continue to analyze is the response from the public. A reward exceeding $1 million has been assembled through combined efforts. In many high-profile cases, a reward of that size leads to a surge in credible tips. However, in this situation, authorities say that has not occurred at the expected level. The lack of substantial information has become part of the investigation itself. Some experts believe that silence may indicate something important about the motive. From that perspective, the offender may not have been driven by financial gain or interest in valuables within the home. Instead, the focus may have been on Nancy Guthrie specifically. That interpretation shifts the direction of the investigation. It suggests a targeted action rather than a spontaneous event. And if that conclusion is accurate, it means the offender made a conscious decision about who to take and why, a decision that may ultimately reveal the motive behind the crime. As investigators continue to develop their analysis, attention has turned toward two primary theories that could explain the motive behind the crime.
With us once again in Tucson, Arizona. Kelly, what more are we learning about that latest news about the DNA found on a glove a couple of miles from Nancy's house?
Well, the snapshot we are getting from investigators is that there's a lot of evidence that they've been dealing with, and a glove and other gloves have been talked about a lot publicly, and they have taken testing of those. They have established DNA profile, and then they've compared it against that database that you referred to, which includes persons all across the country who've been arrested or charged or convicted with a crime. There are differing laws state by state about when someone who's taken into custody must provide their DNA. But it is a vast database, and certainly if there were a criminal history, that would be a good way to identify a potential depositor of that DNA. Then, is it in some way linked to the Guthrie case? That's another big question. So work is being done. There are hundreds of investigators who are on this case working on a stream of different types of approaches. We know, for example, that they have been canvassing gun stores in the area. Why? Because the suspect seen on that doorbell video had a weapon, had a holster that had some interesting identifying markers that authorities are trying to get a better read on. Where was it purchased? What could they learn about?
The first possibility centers on Nancy Guthrie's connection to a nationally recognized public figure. In this scenario, the offender may not have been focused solely on Nancy herself, but rather on what she represents. Crimes of this nature can sometimes be driven by indirect motives, where the intended impact is directed toward someone else. From this perspective, targeting Nancy Guthrie could have been seen as a way to create emotional harm or draw attention. Experts who support this theory point to the level of control displayed during the incident. The timing, the approach, and the absence of visible hesitation suggest a degree of planning that is not typically associated with random criminal behavior. The offender appeared to know when to act and how to avoid detection. This level of precision indicates forethought. It suggests that the individual may have been considering the act long before it occurred. At the same time, investigators are also exploring a second explanation that focuses entirely on vulnerability. In this scenario, Nancy Guthrie may have been selected because she appeared defenseless. At 84 years old, living alone and managing significant health conditions, she would have been perceived as someone unlikely to resist. This theory suggests that the offender identified an opportunity and chose to exploit it. Information about vulnerability does not always require direct interaction. It can be gathered through routine observations. Individuals who visit or pass by a residence, such as delivery drivers, service workers, or even neighbors, may notice patterns over time. They may observe who lives in the home, whether visitors are frequent, and how active the household appears to be. Even brief moments of observation can reveal valuable details to someone with harmful intent. Another factor investigators continue to examine is the behavior captured in available footage. The individual does not appear rushed. There is no clear sign of panic or hesitation. This is significant because it suggests a level of comfort in a situation that would typically create stress. Behavioral analysts often interpret this as an indicator of either prior experience or repeated mental preparation. When an individual has rehearsed an action, either physically or mentally, it can reduce visible signs of anxiety. The act becomes familiar. The movements appear controlled. In this case, that level of composure continues to support the idea that the crime was not spontaneous but deliberate. Whether driven by personal motive or calculated opportunity, the behavior suggests the offender had a clear plan and executed it with intention.
What gives me hope is the sheriff said it's a mixed sample. If that DNA is mixed with Nancy's DNA, then we know that is the person that took her.
As the investigation progresses, authorities are placing increased emphasis on physical and forensic evidence that could lead to identification. One of the most discussed details is the backpack observed in the available footage. Items like this can sometimes provide investigative leads, but they can also present challenges. Products that are widely sold are often difficult to trace to a single buyer. While initial efforts focused on identifying the source, investigators now recognize that such items may have been resold or transferred, complicating the process. Another key area of focus is the potential for biological evidence. Even when an individual attempts to conceal their identity, it is extremely difficult to eliminate all traces. Small exposures, such as an uncovered portion of the face or brief contact with surfaces, can leave behind material that may later be analyzed. Advances in forensic science have made it possible to extract useful information from even minimal samples in cases where direct matches are not found in existing databases. Investigators may turn to alternative methods. One of these methods involves genetic genealogy. By comparing partial DNA profiles with publicly available data, analysts can identify distant relatives and gradually narrow down potential suspects. This approach has been used successfully in previous cases, sometimes years after the crime occurred. Investigators are also reviewing footage for any unique identifying features. This includes possible markings such as tattoos or scars. Even a brief or partial image can become significant when examined closely. Certain designs may be associated with specific regions, communities, or styles, which can help narrow the field of possibilities. Behavioral patterns following the incident are also being closely monitored. Individuals connected to crimes often exhibit changes in their routines. They may withdraw from normal activities, alter their behavior, or display an unusual level of interest in media coverage. These changes may not be immediately obvious, but they can become noticeable to those who are familiar with the individual. Taken together, the evidence and analysis continue to point toward a consistent conclusion. Nancy Guthrie was not selected at random. The timing, the behavior, and the level of control all suggest that the offender acted with purpose. Whether the motive was personal, opportunistic, or a combination of both, the decision appears intentional. Understanding that decision remains one of the most critical steps in identifying who is responsible. After extensive review by investigators and behavioral experts, one detail is beginning to stand out more clearly than anything else. Nancy Guthrie was likely not taken at random. The evidence suggests someone observed her environment, understood her routine, and identified her as vulnerable. This individual may have known she was alone, may have been aware of her medical condition, and may have chosen a moment when the surroundings offered the least resistance. Whether the motive was personal, calculated, or something more complex, investigators believe Nancy Guthrie herself was the focus. She is still missing tonight, and the reward has now grown significantly. Authorities are urging anyone who noticed unusual behavior after February 1st to report it immediately. Even the smallest detail could matter. If you know anything, contact the FBI at 180 call FBI or reach out to local authorities. Someone out there knows the truth.